The pilot said one word, "Okay." But that single confirmation set a chain reaction in motion that no one could stop. The world's worst aviation disaster unfolded in mere seconds. How did it happen? The chain of events began on March 26, 1977, when Pan Am Flight 1736, a Boeing 747-100 with call sign Clipper 1736, took off from Los Angeles International Airport, bound for Las Palmas in the Canary Islands, with a stopover in New York to pick up additional passengers. This flight was chartered by Royal Cruise Lines and was fully booked on its final leg, carrying mostly elderly passengers who were scheduled to board a cruise ship upon arrival in Las Palmas. Las Palmas, the capital of the Canary Islands, is situated on Gran Canaria, one of the 8 main islands of the archipelago. In 1977, the Canary Islands were experiencing political tensions. A group called Movement for the Self-Determination and Independence of the Canary Archipelago was fighting for independence from Spain through both non-violent and violent political campaigns. One of these campaigns would become the first link in the chain of events leading to disaster. In command of Pan Am Flight 1736 was 56-year-old Captain Victor Grubbs. Assisting him were 38-year-old First Officer Robert Bragg and 46-year-old Flight Engineer George Warnes. They were an exceptionally experienced flight crew who took over in New York for the final leg to Las Palmas. When the aircraft arrived in New York, it was delayed by approximately 45 minutes, which meant the outbound flight to Las Palmas was also delayed. At approximately 7:42, Clipper 1736 took off from JFK International Airport with 16 crew members and 380 passengers on board. While the Pan Am aircraft was crossing the Atlantic, another Boeing 747, KLM Flight 4805, was preparing to depart from Amsterdam for Las Palmas. This flight was chartered by Holland International Travel Group. The plan was to bring passengers to Las Palmas, make a quick turnaround, and return to Amsterdam as KLM Flight 4806, making for a long day for the crew. In command of the KLM flight was Captain Jacob Veldhuizen van Zanten, 50 years old at the time and serving as chief flight instructor for KLM's Boeing 747 fleet. This meant he spent much of his time in simulators, training other pilots rather than flying actual aircraft. First Officer Klaas Mers had been trained on the 747 by Captain Van Zanten and had been checked out by him just a few months earlier. Flight engineer Willem Schroeder was highly experienced and known for not being afraid to speak his mind, a trait that would prove significant later. Around 9 a.m. on March 27, 1977, KLM Flight 4805 departed Amsterdam with 14 crew members and 234 passengers bound for Las Palmas. As these two aircraft made their way toward Las Palmas, 2 young men entered the terminal building at Las Palmas Airport. They lingered near a flower shop close to the check-in desks before hurriedly exiting the terminal, leaving behind a ticking bag. At approximately 1 p.m., a desk clerk received a phone call from someone claiming to represent MPIA-C, warning that bombs had been placed inside the terminal building and that they had 15 minutes to evacuate. Almost precisely 15 minutes later, the bomb exploded, causing part of the roof to collapse and injuring 4 people. Since the caller had mentioned bombs in plural, authorities had to assume there were more explosives. They decided to close Las Palmas Airport and divert all incoming flights. Almost simultaneously, KLM Flight 4805 arrived in the holding pattern above Las Palmas. Initially told to hold, they were soon informed that the airport was closed indefinitely and were instructed to divert to Los Rodeos Airport in Tenerife, a short 25-minute flight away. At around 1:38 p.m., the KLM 747 landed on runway 30 at Los Rodeos and taxied to the apron near the terminal building. Pan Am Flight 1736, also holding above Las Palmas, requested permission to continue holding because they had substantial extra fuel. However, they too were directed to divert to Los Rodeos, landing at around 2:15 p.m., about 37 minutes after the KLM flight. By this time, Los Rodeos was becoming crowded with diverted aircraft, filling both the apron and taxiways. Los Rodeos Airport, now Tenerife North Airport, was situated in the northeastern corner of Tenerife at an altitude of about 2,000 feet. Tenerife is dominated by Mount Teide, Spain's highest peak, a volcano that creates unique meteorological conditions. Humid trade winds from the Atlantic are forced up against the mountainside, cooling and condensing to form clouds or fog, which can develop rapidly. While the southern side of Tenerife is typically sunny, the north is usually humid with frequent rain and abundant vegetation. Because the airport sits at 2,000 feet, even relatively low clouds can reach ground level, creating a phenomenon different from typical fog. Instead of consistent visibility, rolling clouds create dramatic variations. Visibility might be several kilometers 1 minute and drop to 300 meters just minutes later. Los Rodeos also had a poor safety record. Due to these concerns, a new airport was being built in southern Tenerife, where weather conditions were more favorable. This new airport was nearly ready for use in 1977, but remained unopened due to political disputes. Unlike Los Rodeos, the new airport was equipped with ground radar, a crucial technology that Los Rodeos lacked. When the KLM flight parked at the terminal, Captain Van Zanten initially wanted passengers to remain on board, hoping for a quick departure. After about 20 minutes, realizing the delay would be longer, he allowed passengers to disembark into the terminal building. The Pan Am crew, arriving later, wanted to do the same, but were told the terminal was already full with KLM passengers. They decided to keep everyone on board but requested stairs so passengers could stretch their legs and get fresh air. The KLM passengers remained in the terminal for about 2 hours before reboarding. During this time, the atmosphere in the two cockpits differed dramatically. In the Pan Am cockpit, Captain Grubbs maintained positive spirits despite the long day. He invited passengers to visit the flight deck and gave tours of the 747. In contrast, the KLM cockpit was tense. The crew discussed recent changes to Dutch flight time limitation laws, which had become much stricter. Captain Van Zanten was concerned about potential delays, causing them to exceed these limits. The crew was anxious about getting stuck overnight in Las Palmas. Van Zanten mentioned that his wife might hear about the bombing and worry if she knew he was staying there. They were actively looking for ways to minimize delays to ensure their return to Amsterdam. This concern led Van Zanten to make a critical decision. While waiting at Los Rodeos, he would refuel the aircraft with enough fuel for both the short hop to Las Palmas and the return flight to Amsterdam, minimizing ground time at Las Palmas. This was a reasonable decision given the circumstances, utilizing the wait time efficiently. However, once refueling began, it couldn't easily be stopped. Van Zanten was essentially gambling that the delay would last long enough to complete refueling. Additionally, the extra fuel made the aircraft approximately 15% heavier, requiring higher takeoff speed and longer runway distance. Shortly after refueling began, they received notice that Las Palmas had reopened. The weather at Los Rodeos was still acceptable, but lower clouds were beginning to roll in, gradually reducing visibility. Captain Grubbs, in the Pan Am flight, requested clearance to start engines and depart, but was told that the KLM flight was refueling and blocking the taxiway. There wasn't enough clearance for Pan Am to maneuver past. Grubbs would have to wait for KLM to finish refueling and depart first. Frustrated, Grubbs sent his flight engineer and first officer to physically measure if they could squeeze past the KLM jet. They returned, confirming it was impossible. They were less than 20 feet short of the necessary clearance. At approximately 4:45 p.m., KLM completed refueling. By this time, all passengers had reboarded except one, Mrs. Robina Monique van Landschot, who worked for the charter company and had a boyfriend in Tenerife. She arranged to stay behind, a decision that would save her life. Captain Van Zanten and his crew were working through pre-departure procedures. Despite trying to maintain proper checklist discipline at first, Van Zanten soon took over, requesting startup clearance himself, a task normally handled by the first officer, suggesting his own growing impatience. Around 4:56 p.m., KLM started engines and received clearance to taxi to runway 12. As they approached the holding position, they were instructed to enter runway 12, backtrack, and exit at the third taxiway on their left. The first officer misheard this as first exit, a common error as first and third sound similar over radio. When the controller corrected this, he changed the instructions to backtrack all the way to the end of the runway, make a 180-degree turn, and hold position. Despite these instructions, Captain Van Zanten twice sought confirmation about which taxiway to use, suggesting possible confusion or distraction. While this could indicate a loss of situational awareness, it's also common practice for captains to repeatedly verify taxi routes in low visibility, especially with non-functioning centerline lights. As KLM taxied, visibility dropped to around 500 meters officially, though some witnesses estimated it was as low as 100 meters at times. The situation was exactly as described earlier. Cloud banks moving across the runway created rapidly changing visibility conditions. The KLM cockpit voice recorder indicates the windshield wipers were on for several minutes, but were turned off as they reached the end of the runway and began their turn, suggesting slightly improved visibility in that area. Meanwhile, Pan Am received startup clearance. As they taxied toward runway 12, Captain Grubbs indicated to his crew that he would prefer to wait off the runway until KLM departed. Unfortunately, this preference was never communicated to air traffic control due to radio calls and frequency changes. When they switched to the approach frequency, they received the same instructions previously given to KLM. Enter runway 12, backtrack, and exit at the third left taxiway. Despite his reservations, Captain Grubbs accepted these instructions without objection, possibly because he wanted to avoid communication difficulties with controllers who were not native English speakers. As Pan Am backtracked, the crew discussed which exit they should take. Like KLM, they were unsure whether to use the first or third exit. This confusion was understandable given the airport's layout. The third exit on the left, while backtracking, was actually a high-speed turnoff for aircraft landing on runway 30. For a 747 backtracking, this would require an impossible 148-degree turn left, followed by another 148-degree turn right. The Pan Am crew wondered if the controller meant the fourth exit, Charlie 4, instead, which would allow a more manageable 35-degree turn. Before Pan Am could clarify, the controller asked KLM to confirm which taxiway they had passed. KLM replied that they thought they had just passed Charlie 4, indicating the continuing poor visibility. At approximately 5:03 p.m., Pan Am's first officer radioed, "Confirm we are to taxi off on the third exit," emphasizing the third. The controller answered, "Affirm, taxi off on the third exit, 1, 2, 3, and third." Pan Am acknowledged with, "Okay, thank you." During this exchange, the KLM cockpit was silent, suggesting they were listening. They may have misinterpreted Pan Am's question to mean that Pan Am was approaching their exit, about to leave the runway, when in reality Pan Am was much further back. In the Pan Am cockpit, the crew maintained a relaxed atmosphere, joking in Spanish about uno, dos, tres for the taxiway exits. They were also executing their before takeoff checklist. As they taxied, they called out the first and second exits, but curiously never mentioned seeing the third exit, the one they were supposed to take. This may be because they were distracted by KLM's departure clearance communications, which they were monitoring with interest, since they would be following the same route. Around 5:04 p.m., the controller instructed Pan Am 7135 to report when leaving the runway. This was the wrong call sign, but Pan Am simply responded, 1736, acknowledging the instruction. This brief exchange could have been misinterpreted by KLM as confirmation that Pan Am was exiting the runway, rather than an acknowledgement to report when they eventually would exit. Moments later, the controller informed both aircraft that the centerline lights were out of service. This significantly increased the minimum visibility required for takeoff to over 800 meters. Pan Am's crew discussed this, but KLM's did not, possibly because visibility at their end of the runway seemed better. At the runway's end, KLM Flight 4805 completed its 180-degree turn and faced the takeoff direction. Captain Van Zanten immediately began advancing the thrust levers, but First Officer Mers interrupted, saying, "Wait a minute, we haven't got any clearance." Van Zanten reduced thrust to idle, replying, "I know that." "Go ahead, ask." Mers radioed KLM 8504. "We are ready for takeoff and we are waiting for ATC clearance," effectively requesting both takeoff and en route clearances simultaneously. The controller responded with the route clearance. KLM 8705, you are cleared to the Papa Beacon, climb to maintain flight level 90, Right turn after takeoff to proceed on heading 40 degrees to intercept Radio 325 towards Las Palmas VOR. Though this included the word takeoff, it was an in-rear clearance, not takeoff authorization. Van Anten interpreted it as complete clearance, exclaiming, "Yeah!" and advancing the thrust levers again. Under pressure, First Officer Mers read back, "Roger, sir. We are clear to the Papa Beacon, flight level 90, right turn 40 degrees until intercepting 325, and we are now at takeoff." While reading back, Van Zanten had already said, "Let's go, check thrust, and advance to takeoff power." This explains why Mers added, "We are now at takeoff," or "We are taking off." The exact wording remains unclear from the cockpit voice recorder. The time was approximately 5:06 p.m. In about 39 seconds, the worst aviation disaster in history would occur. Yet 3 opportunities to prevent it still remained. The controller, interpreting "We are at takeoff" as meaning at takeoff position, responded with "OK," followed by "Stand by for takeoff. I will call you." Simultaneously, Pan Am, still on the runway, radioed, "We're still taxiing down the runway, Clipper 1736. These overlapping transmissions created interference. In the KLM cockpit, they heard only the controller's "OK," followed by a shrill noise. Neither the controller's standby instruction nor Pan Am's warning that they were still on the runway came through. The controller then asked Pan Am to confirm when you cleared the runway. Pan Am replied, "Affirm, we will confirm when we are clear of the runway, Clipper 1736. As these exchanges occurred, KLM was accelerating through the fog. Flight engineer Schroeder, with a lower workload during takeoff, heard these radio messages and at around 5:06 p.m. asked, "So, are they not clear of the runway then?" Van Zanten, focused on takeoff, initially didn't hear, asking, "What did you say?" Schrader repeated, "So is he not clear of the runway then, the Pan Am?" Van Zanten replied confidently, "Oh yes." This was the final missed opportunity to prevent disaster. Around 5:06 p.m., just 11 seconds before impact, Captain Grubb spotted KLM's approaching lights through the fog. Initially thinking they were stationary, he soon realized the danger, exclaiming, "That SOB is coming." First Officer Bragg shouted, "Get off! Get off!" Grubbs turned the aircraft hard left, attempting to clear the runway, and applied full thrust. But at 340 tons, the aircraft couldn't accelerate quickly, reaching only about 20 knots before impact. In the KLM cockpit, Captain Van Zanten had just heard the V1 call out and was about to rotate when he saw Pan Am's silhouette ahead. He pulled back hard on the controls, causing a tail strike that left 20 meters of metal scraping on the runway. His last words were a Dutch profanity, "Oh Godverdamme," as the aircraft briefly became airborne just before collision. KLM's right outboard engine sliced into Pan Am's upper deck first-class lounge. The landing gear tore into the fuselage while the left wing sheared off Pan Am's tail section, causing catastrophic damage. KLM continued flying another 150 meters before crashing without landing gear, sliding several hundred meters while turning clockwise. Fire erupted immediately, killing all 248 people aboard. In the Pan Am aircraft, chaos ensued. Most passengers had no time to understand what happened. Remarkably, all 3 cockpit crew initially survived the impact. As the flight engineer reached for engine fire handles, he found part of the cockpit roof missing. Passengers who survived escaped through holes in the fuselage, some jumping nearly 20 feet to the ground. Others escaped from the rear through a hole in the roof, climbing onto the wings before descending. Of 396 people aboard Pan Am, only 61 survived. The controller remained unaware of the disaster due to the poor visibility and lack of ground radar. Only when another aircraft reported flames on the runway did he activate the alarm. Firefighters had to drive slowly through the fog. Their first indication was intense heat. Then the KLM wreckage fully engulfed in flames. Splitting their forces, they discovered the Pan Am aircraft further down the runway. Recognizing KLM was beyond help, they focused on Pan Am, using foam to prevent aviation fuel from igniting and saving many evacuees. The investigation shocked the world. Investigators recovered both cockpit voice recorders and flight data recorders quickly. The Spanish final report primarily blamed KLM Captain Van Zanten for taking off without ATC clearance, not stopping when told to stand by, not stopping when Pan Am reported still being on the runway, not stopping when his flight engineer questioned Pan Am's position. The Dutch investigation team, while accepting these findings, looked deeper into psychological factors. They examined suboptimal teamwork, language barriers, and possible controller distraction. Many subsequent analyses focused on cockpit authority dynamics between Van Zanten and Mers. However, this overlooks that Mers was an experienced pilot with 9,200 hours who had previously challenged Van Zanten when he attempted to begin takeoff without clearance. Mers was capable of speaking up, but likely believed the runway was clear despite procedural concern. This tragedy led to fundamental changes in aviation safety, standardized radio phraseology, the word takeoff is now used only in actual takeoff clearances, enhanced crew resource management training, improved runway marking for low visibility, mandatory ground radar at major airports. You think you've seen terrifying? Wait until the cockpit window explodes and the pilot is sucked out mid-flight. This isn't fiction. It happened. Watch pilot sucked out a cockpit window at 23,000 feet. Click on the video on your screen now.